Music, music. Their music is something present in your great-grandmother's kitchen that you will never find inside your own. Not due to changing fashions, not because tastes shifted or superior alternatives appeared or the modern palate simply evolved beyond it. Rather, it was removed systematically, legally, with intention, from the American food supply across roughly 50 years, swapped for something more affordable, more lucrative, something your body fails to recognize as edible. No matter how many decades it's been forced to handle it, and the removal was so absolute, so exhaustive, so culturally sweeping that the majority of Americans alive today have never sampled the original and remain unaware of its absence. I'm referring to animal fats, specifically tallow, lard, and butter as the core cooking fats of the American diet. The fats every human civilization relied on for millennia. The fats your own ancestors cooked with, preserved with, baked with, treated illnesses with, and survived on through winters, famines, sea crossings, and the taming of a continent. Fats that served not merely as sustenance, but as medicine, not just nourishment but survival itself. And they got replaced in a single century by seed oils, cottonseed oil, soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil. Industrial products extracted via chemical methods that didn't exist before the 1900s, derived from crops no human civilization in history had ever turned to as a main source of dietary fat. Products requiring factories' hexane solvents, deodorizers, and bleaching agents just to become palatable. Products your great-grandmother, had she tasted them in raw form, would never have recognized as food. And we were told this counted as progress. This raises a simple but essential question. How does a civilization abandon the foods that nourished it for thousands of years and adopt industrial substitutes within a single lifetime? The answer, the more I dug, wasn't nutritional science. It was profit. It was corporate power. It was one of the most effective campaigns of dietary manipulation in human history. And it began not in a laboratory, but in a soap factory. Start with Procter Gamble, because this tale starts with soap. In the early 1900s, Procter Gamble ran a soap and candle business that had created a process to hydrogenate cottonseed oil, turning a liquid industrial waste byproduct into a solid white substance resembling lard. The original goal was to produce a cheaper raw material for soap and candle manufacturing. But someone at the company gazed at this white, solid, odorless material and imagined something else, not soap, food. If you could persuade the American public that this hydrogenated cottonseed oil made a suitable stand-in for the animal fats they'd cooked with for their entire existence as a species, the profit margins would be enormous. Cottonseed was a leftover byproduct of the cotton industry. It cost almost nothing. Lard and tallow came from animals that needed raising, feeding, slaughtering, and processing. The financial incentive was overwhelming. In 1911, Procter & Gamble launched Crisco. The name came from crystallized cottonseed oil. The marketing push that accompanied its release was, by the era's standards, groundbreaking. Procter & Gamble didn't merely advertise Crisco. They published a free cookbook. They mailed it to every household they could reach. The cookbook featured recipes specifically engineered to use Crisco in place of lard and butter. Recipes that wove the product into the daily cooking routines of American homes. They pitched Crisco as modern, clean, scientific, the enlightened alternative to animal fats, which they painted as heavy, outdated, and unhealthy. They gave Crisco to hospitals. They gave it to schools. They gave it to Jewish communities, marketing it as perev, neither meat nor dairy, so it could be used in any meal under kosher dietary laws. They infiltrated every institution shaping eating habits, and they did so with the accuracy of a military operation. The pattern repeats with unsettling sameness, because Crisco wasn't sold on its own merits as a food. It was sold as a replacement. The whole marketing strategy relied on first convincing the public that whatever was being replaced was bad. That lard was heavy and hard to digest. That tallow was primitive, that butter was dangerous, that the animal fats which had sustained every human civilization in recorded history had suddenly, in the early 1900s, been discovered to be harmful. Not through studies, not through clinical trials, but through advertising, through repetition, through the slow, steady erosion of faith in the foods your grandmother's hands had known instinctively. The deeper I dug into the nutritional science of this era, the more the science began to look like an the fact justification. Because genuine scientific research into dietary fat didn't seriously begin until decades after Crisco and its rivals had already taken over the American kitchen. The science followed the market. It didn't lead it. And when the science did arrive, it arrived in a form that perfectly suited the vegetable oil industry's interests. Ancel Keys, the name that changed everything. In the 1950s and 1960s, Keyes proposed the diet heart hypothesis, the idea that saturated fat, the kind found in animal products, raises cholesterol, and that elevated cholesterol causes heart disease. His 7-country study, published in 1970, appeared to show a link between saturated fat consumption and heart disease mortality across different national populations. The study wielded influence far beyond any reasonable measure of its rigor. Critics observed, and have continued to observe for decades, that Keyes selected his 7 countries from a much larger data set, that nations not fitting the hypothesis were left out, that the link between saturated fat and heart disease vanished when the full data set was examined, that the study showed correlation, not causation, that confounding variables, sugar intake, smoking rates, physical activity levels, weren't adequately controlled for, that the conclusions were, at best, premature. None of this mattered. The diet heart hypothesis was embraced by the American Heart Association. It was embraced by the U.S. government. The 1977 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the first comprehensive federal nutritional guidance ever published, told the American public to cut back on saturated fat and replace animal fats with vegetable oils. The United States government, wielding the authority of federal nutritional science, told 300 million people to stop eating the fats their ancestors had thrived on and start eating industrial products manufactured from seeds. The silence was striking when I searched for opposing voices, because opposing voices did exist. Nutritionists, biochemists, clinicians who worked with actual patients rather than epidemiological datasets raised concerns from the start. They pointed out that traditional populations with high saturated fat consumption, the Maasai, the Inuit, the Tokelau Islanders, showed remarkably low rates of heart disease. They pointed out that the American heart disease epidemic had begun in the early 1900s, precisely when vegetable oils were entering the food supply and traditional animal fats were being pushed out. They pointed out that the biochemistry of seed oils, their high concentration of omega-6, polyunsaturated fatty acids, their instability when heated, their tendency to oxidize and form inflammatory compounds, suggested these oils might be causing the very diseases they were supposed to prevent. These voices were sidelined. Their funding was cut. Their papers were rejected or ignored. Their careers were damaged. The institutional power of the American Heart Association, the federal government, and the vegetable oil industry, by the 1970s a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, created an information environment where questioning the diet heart hypothesis was treated not as science but as heresy, as if everyone were following instructions they didn't fully grasp. And here's what happened. While the nation followed the guidelines, Americans cut back on animal fats. They increased their vegetable oil intake. They did exactly what they were told, and heart disease rates didn't fall as promised. Obesity rates exploded. Type 2 diabetes went from a relatively rare condition to an epidemic affecting tens of millions. Inflammatory diseases, autoimmune conditions, metabolic syndrome, all surged in the decades following the dietary shift. The country grew sicker, not despite following the guidelines, but alongside following them. The official explanation falls apart here, because defenders of the dietary guidelines have spent 50 years explaining why the results don't match the predictions. Americans aren't following the guidelines closely enough. Americans are eating too many total calories. Americans are too sedentary. The explanations multiply. The blame is always shifted back to the individual. You're not doing it right. You're not trying hard enough. The guidelines are sound. You are the problem. But the deeper I looked, the more the timeline told a different story. The story of a food supply fundamentally altered not by consumer choice, but by industrial strategy and government policy. Ways that removed foods the human body had evolved to process and replaced them with foods the human body had never encountered. Consider what lard actually is. It's rendered pig fat. It contains roughly 40% saturated fat, 40% monounsaturated fat, and about 10% polyunsaturated fat. Its fatty acid profile closely resembles human cell membranes. It's stable at high heat. It doesn't oxidize easily. It has been used for cooking in virtually every pork, eating culture on Earth for thousands of years. Your cells recognize it. Your digestive system processes it efficiently. Your body knows what to do with it. Now consider what soybean oil is. It's extracted from soybeans using a chemical solvent, typically hexane, a neurotoxin derived from petroleum. The crude oil from this extraction is then degummed, neutralized with caustic soda, bleached with Fuller's earth, and deodorized through high-temperature steam distillation. The finished product contains a high concentration of omega-6 fatty acids, which in excess promotes systemic inflammation. It oxidizes readily when heated, producing compounds linked in lab studies to cellular damage. No human population in history consumed this substance before the 20th century. Your body has no evolutionary framework for processing it. Your cells have never seen it before. And this is what we were told was healthier. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the entire food industry. Because replacing animal fats with seed oils wasn't an isolated incident. It was the template, the blueprint for how an industrial food product displaces a traditional one. You need three things: an industrial product with a better profit margin than the traditional food, a science-sounding justification for the swap, however flimsy, and an institutional apparatus, governmental, medical, educational, willing to enforce the replacement through guidelines, recommendations, and the slow strangulation of the traditional product's market share. Butter was replaced by margarine, whole milk by skim. Egg consumption was demonized for decades based on cholesterol fears that later research has largely debunked. Organ meats, the most nutrient-dense foods in the human diet, foods every traditional culture prized and preserved, became objects of disgust rather than nutrition. Bone broth, a medicinal staple in every culture on Earth, virtually disappeared from the American diet. Fermented foods, preserved meats, raw dairy, all were marginalized, regulated, or outright banned, replaced by processed alternatives that were more profitable, more shelf-stable, more compatible with industrial food distribution, and less compatible with human biology. The deeper I went, the more the modern American diet looked less like the product of scientific understanding and more like the product of industrial optimization. Every change in the dietary guidelines, every nutritional recommendation from the last century, Every shift in what Americans were told to eat and avoid aligned more consistently with the food industry's economic interests than with the health outcomes of the population following the advice. Not every time, not in every detail, but with a consistency that coincidence can't comfortably explain. And here's what I keep coming back to, the physical evidence. Your body is the evidence. The chronic disease epidemic in America is the evidence. The fact that the generation raised on the Dietary Guidelines is the sickest generation in American history is the evidence. The fact that diseases of metabolic dysfunction, conditions that barely existed when your great-grandmother was cooking with lard, butter, and tallow, are now the leading causes of death in the United States is the evidence. The evidence isn't hidden. It's standing on a scale in a doctor's office, wondering why it followed every recommendation and ended up here. I'm not telling you to throw out your vegetable oil tonight. I'm not telling you lard is a miracle cure. I'm asking why the foods that sustained the human species for 100,000 years were replaced within a single century by industrial products that need chemical solvents and bleaching agents to become edible. I'm asking who benefited from that replacement and who suffered from it. I'm asking why the science that justified the replacement has been questioned by researchers for 50 years without the guidelines changing in proportion to the evidence. I'm asking why the dietary advice given to 300 million Americans more closely resembles a marketing strategy for commodity crops than a prescription for human health. I'm asking what your great-grandmother knew that you've been taught to forget. What she kept in that jar by the stove that you've never seen. What she rendered and stored and cooked with every day of her life that made her generation leaner, stronger, and less chronically ill than the generation that followed. The guidelines meant to improve upon her. Handed a bottle of vegetable oil and told it was the healthier choice. What else have we been handed and never thought to question?